Also, guten Abend. Mein Name ist Heinrich Röder. Wir warten noch 2, 3 Minuten, dann geht's richtig los. Bis gleich. Tschüss. So, wir fangen da mal an. Also ich stelle mich nochmal vor. Mein Name ist Heinrich Röder. Ich bin einer der beiden Vorstandsmitglieder der Freiburger Diskurse. Heute Abend stellen wir ein Buch vor, das jetzt vor kurzem ins Deutsche übersetzt worden ist. Das Buch heißt in Englisch Reclaiming the State, auf Deutsch, wie wir den Staat zurückgewinnen können. Das ist etwas kurios. Wir machen eine englische Veranstaltung über die deutsche Übersetzung eines Buches, aber wir werden die Beiträge, die auf Englisch kommen, auch ins Deutsche übersetzen, sodass diejenigen, die des Englischen nicht so mächtig sind, dem Abend auch folgen können, vielleicht Interesse daran haben, danach in das Buch reinzugucken. Machen wir weiter. Für die, die uns noch nicht kennen, uns gibt es seit 2018, das ist unsere 44. Veranstaltung. Wir sind jetzt fast nur noch im Internet vertreten. Gelegentlich machen wir auch Hybridveranstaltungen in Freiburg. Sie können unseren YouTube-Kanal abonnieren oder auch da einzelne Veranstaltungen nachgucken. Fast alles ist dort zu finden. Unser Leitbild, ganz kurz formuliert, ist die demokratiekonforme Marktwirtschaft und als Gegenentwurf zur marktkonformen Demokratie. Also die Marktwirtschaft hat sich nach der Demokratie zu richten und nicht umgekehrt. Ja. Wir brauchen auch Geld. Wir freuen uns über Spenden. Sie finden auf unserer Website unser Bankkonto bei der Volksbank in Freiburg und Sie können auch über PayPal uns zahlen. Wir freuen uns über jeden Euro, den wir bekommen. So. Jetzt kommen wir zum heutigen Abend. Das ist ein Gespräch mit Thomas Fazi. Das Gespräch werden Stefan Kraft und Ulrike Simon führen. Stefan Kraft ist Verleger des Promedia Verlages in Wien und Ulrike Simon ist Redakteurin bei Makroskop und hat auch das Vorwort zu dem Buch geschrieben und ist auch in weiten Teilen ins Deutsche übersetzt. War viel Arbeit. Machen wir weiter. Jetzt die zentrale Figur, das ist Thomas Fazi. Das ist in London geboren, lebt heute in Italien, arbeitet dort als Publizist und Journalist. Zusammen mit William Mitchell hat er dieses Buch 2017 geschrieben, Reclaiming the State. Und wir haben es eben bei Makroskop, der Edition Makroskop ins Deutsche übersetzt. Und heute Abend wollen wir über die Inhalte dieses Buches diskutieren. Das ist die Struktur. Wir sind gerade bei der Einführung, die ich mache. Jetzt kommen gleich Ulrike Simon, Stefan Kraft, Thomas Fazi dazu und ich verschwinde, überlasse den englisch sprechenden Menschen die Arena. Okay, you all can come in. Now we can start. Okay, good evening, everybody. I leave now the screen and you can have your discussion. See you later.
Thank you, Heinrich, and good evening from my side to the book presentation of this book here, Wie wir den Staat zurückgewinnen, Souveränität in einer Welt nach dem Neoliberalismus. My name is Stefan Kraft from Promedia Verlag in Wien, or Promedia Publishing House in Vienna, and we've published this book together with Makroskop. Thank you, Heinrich. Thank you, Ulrike, for the cooperation. The original title of this book is called Reclaiming the State, a Progressive Vision of Sovereignty for a Post-Neoliberal World. And it was published by Pluto Books originally and translated into German by Ulrike Simon, who will also take part in our discussion here. I'd just like to give you a short summary of our program for this evening. Will be the following. First, I would like Thomas to give us a brief summary of his book and its main topics. Then I will direct some questions to Thomas, and then you, the audience, will have the chance for questions or statements, and I think Heinrich will explain the concrete technical details, how you can ask questions to Thomas. And because most of us, including me, may not understand everything in detail that Thomas says, Ulrike will provide a brief summary in German from time to time. Okay, so Thomas, please introduce us to your book.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, and thanks, of course, to Heinrich and to Ulrike as well for the great job you've done on the German edition of the book. I am incredibly grateful and happy to see the book coming out in German. At a time when I think this book can be helpful to navigate through the times that we're living in, and hopefully also provide some political guidance, especially to those on the left. So the book was published originally in 2017, at a time when the West was going through sort of the first wave of anti-establishment, sort of, the first wave of the populist uprising of the, I would say, of the 21st century, which came on the heels, of course, of the financial crisis and the fallout of the financial crisis. And when the book came out, we had already seen several manifestations of this sort of populist revolt. We'd had the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. We'd had the election, the first election of Donald Trump in the US. We were witnessing the rise of sort of Eurosceptic or openly anti-EU movements and parties throughout Europe, and we saw this as sort of different manifestations of a rejection of the neoliberal order, which had essentially dominated the West for the previous decades. And this also took the form of a demand for greater national sovereignty. So the question of sovereignty, the question of national sovereignty, had also once again come to the center stage of Western politics for the first time in a very long time, because throughout the neoliberal era, we had essentially been told that nation states were obsolete, that national sovereignty was obsolete, and that the world was going towards greater levels of international and supranational integration, and that was history's natural course, and that for this reason Europe and the European Union were in fact at the forefront of this correct historical path. And in fact, all those various crises that broke out in the second half of the 2010s, effectively disproved this reading, and in fact showed that throughout the West there was a growing demand for greater national sovereignty, and people were increasingly rejecting the kind of the dogmas of neoliberalism, of globalization, of globalism, because of the extensive damage that they had caused, that these ideologies had caused throughout the West, not just in economic terms. We know the disastrous effects that neoliberal globalization has had on the living and working conditions of Western working classes, but also in political and democratic terms. Neoliberalism had entailed a transfer of power to both international and supranational organizations, which had progressively hollowed out democracy, and people were in various ways, by voting to leave the EU and the UK, or even by voting a sort of neo-nationalist like Trump, they were saying that that in fact they wanted greater control over the destiny of their nations, and they weren't happy with the idea of essentially the decision-making process having been surrendered to these international and supranational authorities, over which people had and still have, obviously to this day, very little control. And but we also noted that this anti-establishment revolt was largely being capitalized by the right and the extreme right, if you want, or the populist right. This was already true at the time. Of course, the sort of mainstream left social democratic parties had already largely been electorally wiped out, and there were some examples at the time of parties on the left, i.e. to the left of left mainstream parties, which had succeeded in making inroads in the West. And we saw this as a positive development. So at the time, we still had, for example, Bernie Sanders in the US, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Podemos in Spain, Mélenchon in France. I would also include, even though it's not a traditional sort of left-wing party, I would also include the Five-Star Movement for a number of reasons, which in fact would go into government in Italy the year following the book's publication. And of course, we even had an example of a radical left party which had succeeded in taking power in Greece, Syriza. And so we saw this. So we saw these developments, but we also noted that these developments were sort of exceptions to the rule. It was mostly parties on the right that were, proving to be better at tapping into the grievances of the masses at this time of anti-establishment revolt, at this time of revolt against the sort of neoliberal status quo. And and in the book, we sort of try to understand why this is the case, why the forces of the right had been more successful at tapping into these grievances, even though a lot of these grievances were rooted in economic concerns, which the left supposedly should have been good at tapping into, but instead the right was much more effective at tapping into this growing revolt against neoliberalism, even though the left had always criticized neoliberalism, right? And one of the reasons that we identify for this is that the right had been more successful at providing a response to this growing yearning for greater national sovereignty, which, as I said, more and more people were starting to see as the only way to regain some control over politics, some democratic control over politics and society. And this was clearly the issue of sovereignty was very much at the center of the Trump campaign, the Brexit campaign, etc. Though, of course, it was a demand for sovereignty that was very much framed in identitarian and often very sort of exclusivist and sometimes authoritarian terms. And what we said in the book was that one of the reasons that the left hadn't been able to capitalize on this greater demand for sovereignty was that throughout the years, the decades, the left had essentially come to have a very negative view of national sovereignty and of the nation state, which was seen as both ineffective, obsolete in an age of globalization. So the left had largely bought into this the dominant neoliberal narrative of the inevitable sort of extinction of the nation state and the inevitable path towards internationalism and supranationalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, it had also, for several reasons, come to view the nation state as an intrinsically reactionary, if not outright fascist idea. And so, as a result of these two factors, it had effectively it was unable to provide a political response to this demand that was coming from the people. And in fact, and so what we were seeing was this kind of vicious circle where the more people turned to the right, the more the left tended to double down on defending the status quo and on seeing any any declination, any political proposal centered around the nation state as intrinsically reactionary, as intrinsically negative. And in fact, we saw the left in many cases clinging on even harder to the institutions, for example, of the EU, of the European Union. And we saw this as a tragic development. Bill Mitchell, who's the economist with whom I wrote the book, and we saw this development as a tragic development, because we, in fact, came from the standpoint of the fact that national sovereignty and national self-determination are, of course, not intrinsically fascist and reactionary concepts. And in fact, in the book we argue, I think, quite well that these were the basis for pretty much every major economic, social, and political advancement of the past centuries. These were achieved through the institutions of the democratic nation state. So we saw it as a tragic development that the left had come to reject ideas of national sovereignty, ideas of the nation state, and to embrace these fundamentally, structurally anti-democratic, oligarchic, supranational institutions represented most quintessentially by the European Union, in our view. And so what we try to do is, we offer also a very in-depth analysis of the evolution of the left throughout the 70s and 80s and how they came to take these views. But we then also try to make an appeal, if you want, to the left. We try in the book to get the left to understand that a true popular social democratic or socialist, call it whatever you want, left, could only be founded on developing a progressive vision of national sovereignty and of the nation state, and in rejecting the dogmas of supranationalism, of globalism. And then, of course, also of, this also entailed, in our view, a rejection of the kind of identity politics that the left had increasingly, turned to in place of the older, more sort of Marxian, class-sensitive analysis that had defined the left for a very long time. And so we saw these two elements as fundamental if the left wanted to regain a central role in Western politics, and if it wanted to wrestle away from the right, some of the essentially some of the votes, and this, in very, very simple terms, I would say, was the sort of the essence of the book, which sort of was both an analysis and also an exhortation to the left, right? And I think in terms of the analysis, I think it's been fully vindicated by subsequent events, by what has happened since the book was published. Obviously, a lot has changed, but it has changed, I would say, in the direction that we were pointing to in the book: the collapse of the neoliberal order, the sovereignty becoming an even bigger issue in Western politics.
Heinrich is speaking. I would propose that Ulrike makes a summary of the last 20 minutes of Thomas. I think it was a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so sorry. Yes. Feel free to stop.
I think you are nearly at the end of what you wanted to say. Or
no, I mean, yes, I was just going to say that in terms of the analysis, I think we've been correct. But I'm sorry to say we have failed in terms of our exhortation to the left and our appeal to the left, which unfortunately has failed, I would say, to take up our suggestions and our recommendations. And in fact, I would say has moved in the opposite direction, which is why today we see the anti-establishment camp, the populist camp, however you want to call it, effectively even much more than when the book was published, completely monopolized by the right and by the populist right, or the extreme right, if you want to call it that way. And yes, so I think we have been proven right in our analysis, but unfortunately failed in our attempts to bring the left on board with our ideas.
Okay, Ulrike.
Ja, okay. Thomas fängt an damit zu sagen, warum. Ich meine, die Frage ist ja tatsächlich berechtigt. Ein Buch, was 2017 geschrieben wurde und Ereignisse, die 40 Jahre her sind, analysiert, da fragt man sich ja, warum das aktuell ist. Und er sagt halt, dass 2017 hatten wir gerade so die erste Welle des Rechtspopulismus oder Populismus erlebt. Also und da war ja Trump gewählt, die EU-Welle rollte und Brexit kam durch. Und jetzt muss ich mal. Ach so, und damit kam eben eine Frage wieder total ins Zentrum der politischen Diskussion. Und das ist eben die Frage der nationalen Souveränität. Und die EU hatte ja quasi die Führungsrolle darin, dass eben diese Nationalstaaten eben entmachtet wurden und stattdessen supranationale Organisationen aufgebaut wurden. Und diese neoliberale Wende hat im Westen sehr viel Zerstörung angerichtet, sowohl ökonomisch für die Arbeitenden, also gerade für die Arbeiterklasse, und eben hatte als zweites dann eine ganz böse Folgen auch, was die Entpolitisierung betraf, dass also die viele ökonomische und sonstige Entscheidungen nicht mehr, dass die praktisch auf EU-Ebene getroffen wurden und dem politischen Einfluss der Menschen entzogen worden sind. Und davon profitierten hauptsächlich die Rechten, obwohl es damals also vielversprechende linke Bewegungen gab, von Corbyn, Sanders, Podemos, Mélenchon, Syriza in Griechenland, haben doch die Rechten weitaus mehr profitiert und waren sehr viel mehr erfolgreich, schon damals, 2017. Und die Frage, die die Autoren dann gestellt haben, war halt, wieso das kam, dass die Rechten so erfolgreich war. Und die Antwort ist, dass die Linke diese Frage der nationalen Souveränität nicht erkannt hat, wie wichtig das ist. Im Gegenteil, dass für die Linke nationale Souveränität immer, also entweder wurde gesagt, oder es wurde beides gesagt, entweder es ist obsolet, im Zuge der Globalisierung sind die eben entmachtet, die Nationalstaaten, aber auch Nationalstaaten wurden eben per se als reaktionär und faschistisch angesehen. Und ja, und deswegen hat die Linke das eben abgelehnt. Und die tragische Folge davon war, dass die Linke zum Verteidiger des Status quo wurde und eben nicht zum Vorreiter der Anti-Establishment-Bewegung. Und das ist eben bis heute so geblieben. Fazi und Mitchell haben in dem Buch diese Entwicklung dazu nachvollzogen und haben gleichzeitig, also das war die Analyse, die im Buch ist, und gleichzeitig eben auch einen Appell an die Linke wollten sie starten, dass nämlich die Linke eine progressive Version vom Nationalstaat wieder aufnimmt. Eine Vision, die im Grunde schon immer, also alle wichtigen sozialen Errungenschaften wurden im Rahmen von Nationalstaaten erreicht, und deswegen argumentieren sie, dass man eben den progressiv sehen muss, auch heute, um wieder Veränderungen zu erreichen im Sinne der Gesamtbevölkerung. Und ja, und dann auch das mit der Identitätspolitik versus Klassenpolitik, also es ist halt wichtig, dass die Linke wieder die Klassensachen in den Mittelpunkt stellt. Was das Buch nun erreicht hat, oder nicht das Buch, aber was sich entwickelt hat in der ganzen Zeit, dass sich die Analyse bestätigt hat, die im Buch vorhanden ist, aber dass der Appell an die Linke weitgehend erfolglos geblieben ist und dass eben die Rechte heute noch mehr die Anti-Establishment-Bewegung monopolisiert, als das 2017 der Fall war.
Okay. Danke, Ulrike. Thomas, you talked about the yearning for national sovereignty, and we have seen symptoms like the Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. But your work, your book, calls for a progressive national sovereignty. So how do you define this progressive vision of sovereignty? What would be the next step? Would it be something like Austria, Italy, Germany have to leave the European Union, for example? And how does your vision differ from the right-wing populist version that we've seen in recent years, the very successful version?
Right. Well, I think we have to start with a very basic point, and that is that democracy and sovereignty go hand in hand. In fact, I would say that democracy, popular sovereignty, requires national sovereignty. Why is this? For the simple reason that for democracy to be substantive, to be effective, it means that people have to be able to choose between alternatives that are not just about, minor details in terms of how we want to organize society, but also alternatives that can potentially be radically diverse. So alternatives in terms of how we want society to be organized in socioeconomic terms. What do we want the relationship between capital and labor to be like? How do we want to go about for example, the trade-off between employment and inflation? How do we want what do we want? What kind of societies do we want to live in? What role should the state have in a society? Which services should be provided by the state, etc., etc. So in a true democracy, we should be able to choose between parties that offer different visions of how we want to organize society in terms, in raw material terms, right? But of course, for this to be possible, it means that the state in question, the state within which we live and within which we vote, has to possess certain tools, certain basic economic tools, which are necessary for the state to direct, coordinate, intervene in the economy, and therefore have the power to shape society and the economy in one direction or another in a more pro-capital or pro-labor direction. This requires a certain set of tools, which are the basic tools of economic policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, the fiscal policy. These are the basic tools through which a state can regulate and shape the economy, and therefore give shape to whatever, to a program, a political economic program that people have voted for. And in this sense, it is very true that without national sovereignty, and especially economic sovereignty, which I would consider, along with the ability to control your borders, the basis of national sovereignty. I would say you can't even really speak of national sovereignty and even national independence if you don't have economic sovereignty, and especially monetary sovereignty, to the extent that control of the currency is the basis of every other form and shape of economic policy. So, the trouble is that in Europe, we have transferred these basic tools of economic policy to the supranational institutions of the European Union, which are insulated from really any kind of democratic pressure, any kind of democratic control. So all the basic tools of economic policy have been transferred to these anti-democratic, a-democratic, I would say, institutions. And that poses a fundamental problem in sort of basic democratic terms. And it's shocking to me that so many people on the left still don't understand this. This is the reason why the cliche, which has become true, by which whoever you vote for in Europe, you get the same economic policies, whether you vote in, and Italy, my country, is a very sort of clear example of that, since in recent years we have, been governed by parties of the populist left and right. We had in 2018 the League five-star coalition, which then gave way to a government by sort of the embodiment of European technocracy, Mario Draghi, former president of the European Central Bank, and now we have a supposedly right populist in power who should be the opposite of Draghi. But throughout this entire period, which is the period that has essentially passed since the publication of the book to this, up to this day, every government in power has essentially implemented the same policies, which happen to be the policies dictated by the European Union. And this is not a coincidence, because that's effectively the EU controls the levers of our economic policy. And so what that means is that you can elect whoever you want, but once they're elected, they come into the corridors of power, into the control room, and they realize that there are no more levers, there are no more buttons, because they've all been shipped off to Brussels. And that's the reality for pretty much every country of the Eurozone. And so this is problematic for everyone who believes in democracy, but I would say it's especially problematic for those on the left, because if you're a neoliberal, if you're a libertarian who believes in minimal state intervention, or you simply believe that governments should have no say in how the economy is run and it should all be left to markets, then you might not have too much of a problem. And in fact, you might see this as something positive, that governments have no power to meddle in the economy. But if you have a leftist orientation, that means that you favor an interventionist state, a state that regulates the economy in the favor of the people and controls the power of markets, controls the power of private capital, and tries to create an order that is as just, as socially and economically just as possible. but this requires those tools that I mentioned earlier. So it's especially, and this is another sort of one of the other paradoxical aspects of this rejection by the left of the nation state and of sovereignty, because it's precisely the those on the left that should that should have sovereignty at heart, because it's those on the left that whose agenda requires state interventionism. So this is one of the many paradoxes, I would say, of the contemporary left. But so I think this is the, I would say, the basic argument, the basic left argument for national sovereignty. And then, of course, we can get into more detail about what policies one should pursue or not. But I would say that that's of secondary importance, because the basic point is that and this is what I find also curious. You've got endless debates on the on the left, about they spend months drafting these electoral manifestos and electoral programs, some of them even maybe very radical, and then putting aside the fact that usually they're not capable of convincing voters, of convincing enough voters to actually get into power. But the bottom line is that even if they were to get into power, they wouldn't be able to come even close to implementing these very sophisticated economic programs and manifestos that they spent months working on. And I think the most obvious recent case that we saw in Europe, well, not so recent anymore, but probably the last example, most obvious example of this, was the fate of the Syriza government in Greece, which was elected on a radical anti-austerity program, only to in the end be forced to enact an even more radical austerity program than the one they were fighting against, than the one that they were elected to go against. And this was simply due to the fact that they, so long as the Greek government, wasn't willing to consider exiting the euro, then of course they, at the end of the day, they had no choice but to go along with whatever the EU was dictating to them, and that is true. That would be true for any left government that came to power in the eurozone. And so I think it's important to understand that this is a huge constraint on democracy, and especially especially for the parties and movements of the left. This is why. So our progressive case for sovereignty is first and foremost, was first and foremost, and it still is, because I still believe it to be a central topic, is understanding the fundamental link between democracy, and especially social democracy, and national sovereignty, and how this is structurally negated within the European Union, and especially within the eurozone. And in fact, it is also one of the reasons why more and more voters are turning to the right, because at least the right on paper has has no problem about railing against the European Union, railing against the euro, even though less and less so. And this is maybe another topic, something we can also discuss, how, of course, the right's framing of national sovereignty today is also very problematic, but at least they raise the issue. Most parties on the left, and they don't even raise the issue anymore, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why they've become largely meaningless in the European political context.
Thank you, Thomas. We should now give Ulrike the possibility to translate some of it, what you have said. Ulrike?
Ja, okay. Die Frage war, welche Vision von was eine progressive Vision von nationaler Souveränität wäre in Augen von Thomas Fazi. Und da sagt er, dass es sozial, also dass Demokratie und Souveränität untrennbar sind. Das gehört zusammen und es ist keine Demokratie möglich ohne Souveränität. Und das gilt besonders eigentlich für linke Politik, weil wenn linke Politik möchte ja einen Staat haben, der die Wirtschaft oder möchte eine Kontrolle über die Wirtschaft haben, dass die so gelenkt wird, dass sie im Sinne der arbeitenden Bevölkerung gesteuert wird. Also es geht darum, wie wird denn das Verhältnis zwischen Kapital und Arbeit gestaltet? Ist das mehr auf Seiten des Kapitals, ist es mehr für die, auf Seiten Labor, also mehr für die Arbeitnehmer orientiert? Und damit der Staat das machen kann, also dass er da eingreifen kann in diese Wirtschaftssachen, braucht er bestimmte Werkzeuge. Und diese Werkzeuge sind vor allem eben die Geldpolitik und auch die Gestaltung der Wechselkurse und dann eben auch die Fiskalpolitik in dem Sinne, dass er eben bestimmte Investitionen auch macht oder wie auch immer. Und das Problem das Wichtigste dabei ist tatsächlich, dass der Staat Kontrolle über seine eigene Währung hat. Das ist das Zentrale. Und jetzt haben wir vor allem in der EU und vor allem in der Eurozone diese grundlegenden Werkzeuge delegiert an die Institutionen der EU, über die wir keine demokratische Kontrolle haben. Und die Folge ist halt, dass es egal ist, wen man wählt, welche Partei drankommt. Es wird immer die gleiche Politik am Ende gemacht. Italien ist da eben das besondere Beispiel, dass eben auch jetzt die rechtspopulistische Regierung auch nichts anderes letztendlich macht, keine andere ökonomische Politik als Draghi. Und das ist eben die besondere Tragik für die linke Politik, weil wenn ich marktorientierte Politik machen will oder libertärer bin, dann kann man das ja sogar begrüßen, dass es so ist. Wenn ich aber möchte, dass die Ökonomie gestaltet wird im Sinne der Mehrheit der Bevölkerung, dann brauche ich eine Politik, wo ich eben auch wirklich was ändern kann. Und das Tragische ist tatsächlich, dass die Linke heute noch weniger darüber spricht als früher und dass zum Beispiel, dass das eben auch, selbst wenn so tolle Programme, die auch ausgearbeitet werden und an denen lange gearbeitet wird, selbst wenn die an die Regierung kommen mit so einem Programm, eben das keine Chance hat, verwirklicht zu werden, eben man nicht die Frage der Souveränität in den Mittelpunkt stellt, weil man eben sonst gar nichts umsetzen kann. Und Syriza war das in Griechenland, war dafür das beste Beispiel.
Thomas,
Thank you, Ulrike.
Yeah, danke. Since the publishing of your book, the state has become more and more unpopular than ever. So instead of reclaiming the state, many people would prefer destroying it. So this is a huge challenge for you or for anybody who think that reclaiming the state is the starting point for a change. Can you explain this development in the recent years and how can you meet this challenge?
Yeah. So when we published the book, we saw as the main obstacle that we were trying to overcome the kind of the left progressive version of the neoliberal consensus, which kind of saw equated state power and national sovereignty, as I said, with authoritarianism and reactionary politics. And in a way, this obstacle has become even bigger today, because I would say that this view is in a way, now you have a situation where, well, on the one hand, most people on the left probably still view it that way. On the other hand, you have parties and movements on the right which raised the issue of national sovereignty. You've got several sort of Eurosceptic parties that are gaining ground in Europe, and of course the AfD in Germany is an obvious example, but you've got several other examples. But the problem is that they, in many cases, their approach to national sovereignty is somewhat paradoxical, because they raise the issue of national sovereignty, but at the same time they are, in many cases, these parties are very hostile to the state itself. Most of these right populist parties have quite strong libertarian views. They have very pro-market views, very neoliberal views in many cases. And so, while arguing for example, more national sovereignty and the need to reclaim sovereignty back from the EU, at the same time they have a very negative view of the state. And I think this is partly has to do with the political traditions that they come from, maybe not, as well as the fact that a lot of these parties have been sort of co-opted by vested economic interests, but they also reflect the fact that today there is a widespread skepticism of the state, and I think so. In a way, they are also sort of appealing to people's sensitivities, and I think this, especially I think especially on the right, people were sort of very negatively, acutely aware of the expansion of emergency politics and authoritarian interventions, authoritarian even efforts of at social engineering, we might say, the normalization of complete executive overreach that we saw during the COVID era. I think this very much radicalized a lot of people, especially on the right. Many of them, of course, already came, I would say, from a fundamentally state skeptic or anti-statist worldview, but the COVID experience has very much radicalized their views, and I would say that to a large extent those concerns are justified, and that's why the phase we are in is so problematic. It is absolutely true, I think, that the various national states in Europe and even the EU superstate are becoming increasingly authoritarian. We see, the European Union today being engaged in widespread, censorship efforts and efforts to silence, dissenting voices. They're now going after, dissenting journalists, critical journalists, and this is happening at the national level as well as at the, supranational EU level. We can see how the institutions of the various European states are becoming more repressive, are becoming more authoritarian, and so I think it's become harder than ever, I think, to make the case for the need for a strong state. And I think it's again, it's kind of the argument that we tried to make in the book. Ultimately, the state is a tool, and this tool can be used in many ways. We saw, we saw in the past century how the state, which was used in countries like Germany and Italy, to implementing, incredibly authoritarian regimes, then gave way to, post-war democratic regimes, which were, very different in nature, right? But that was saying, no, that was still the state. So the state can be is a tool that can be deployed in many, many different ways. And I think this is ultimately what's very important to understand, and it connects to the issue of democracy. I think one of the reasons that states today get away with with these increasingly authoritarian policies is because they have become increasingly insulated from democracy, and this is itself a result of the structures of the European Union. So in a way, the European Union also in a way paradoxically strengthens national elites, because it allows them to scapegoat the EU for all the decisions they take. So national politicians don't have to be accountable for many of the policies that they take. They can just say, oh, we're simply implementing an EU directive or an EU regulation. So they become completely unaccountable to voters. And so I think, again, this is why the only way to roll back this creeping authoritarianism is to re-democratize our states. But we can only do that if we get out of a system such as that of the European Union, which is fundamentally structured around hollowing out democracy. So I think this is one way, I think, where we can help people understand the link between reclaiming national sovereignty and, in fact, re-democratizing our societies as a way of regaining some democratic control over the state. This is how you get the state. So we need the state to intervene more in certain areas where it is not intervening today. It is not intervening to control, to sufficiently control private capital. It is not intervening to redistribute wealth and power in favor of workers and citizens. It is not intervening in the areas where it should intervene, while at the same time it is heavily intervening, often in people's lives and interfering in the sort of everyday workings of society in very, very negative ways, in ways where the state should be rolled back. When it comes to censorship, when it comes to state repression, when it comes to the repression of protest movements and things of that like, the state should be much more constrained. And so today we have sort of an upside down situation, which is kind of a minimalist state when it comes to intervening in favor of citizens, in favor of workers, but a highly interventionist, a highly authoritarian state when it comes to controlling society in favor of the elites. So I think that's this is another very important point, I think, to understand, and hopefully by making this argument we can win some people over to the need for the problem isn't the state. The problem is the state when it becomes completely unshackled from any real form of democratic control, and I think that's the situation we are in today.
Okay, thank you. Ulrike, bitte.
Ja, also die Frage war, wie kann man denn jetzt darauf reagieren, dass im Grunde der Staat, also man fordert den Staat zurück, aber der Staat ist heute unpopulärer, als er je zuvor war. Und wie kommt das eigentlich und wie kann man das ändern? Und als das Buch geschrieben wurde, war eben das Haupthindernis im politischen Dialog, dass die Linke den Nationalstaat als reaktionär sah. Und das ist heute eigentlich viel stärker geworden, das Problem noch. Und vor allem auch, sie überlassen praktisch den Rechtspopulisten das ganze Feld. Und die Rechtspopulisten haben aber eine sehr widersprüchliche Einstellung zum Staat, weil sie einerseits nationale Souveränität fordern und eben anti-EU sind und wollen aus der EU aussteigen und sind gleichzeitig haben sie aber oft eine ganz starke Anti-Staat-Einstellung. Und das hat viele Gründe bei den Rechten, aber vor allem ist es auch so, dass sie damit anknüpfen können an bestimmte Empfindungen, oder Sensibilitäten, die das Klientel eben hat, weil der heutige Staat als extrem autoritär und immer autoritärer wahrgenommen wird von vielen Menschen. Und das hat mit vielen Sachen zu tun, zum Beispiel mit Identitätspolitik und Gendern. Das ist ja ein beliebtes Thema, wo man sagt, der Staat greift da ein, wo er nicht eingreifen soll. Die Covid-Maßnahmen waren da ein ganz großer Einschnitt, was viele Leute eben als Eingriff in ihre Freiheitsrechte empfunden haben. Und das ist eben auch nicht nur eine Empfindung der Leute, sondern auch eine Tatsache, wenn man beobachtet, dass eben EU-weit Zensur immer stärker wird, dass auch Journalisten angegriffen werden. Und dann ist es eben extrem schwierig, in so einer Situation einen starken Staat zu fordern, wenn man doch den Staat erfährt als einen starken Staat, aber gegen sich selber gerichteten. Und da argumentiert Thomas jetzt, dass der Staat eigentlich nur ein Werkzeug ist. Und es eben die große Frage ist, wie dieses Werkzeug angewendet werden kann. Es kann halt für faschistische Systeme genommen werden, es kann für die Nachkriegswohlfahrtsstaaten verwendet werden. Und wir haben halt heute das Problem, dass dadurch, dass die EU eben ganz viel Demokratie von der Ebene der Nationalstaaten weggeholt hat, ermöglicht dieses System im Grunde den nationalen Eliten auch autoritäres Verhalten, weil die ja das Ganze dann auf die EU schieben können und sagen, also sie sind dann eben gar nicht mehr Rechenschaft schuldig, weil sie können ja nichts dafür, das hat ja alles die EU gemacht. Und deswegen sollte man eben auch in dem Zusammenhang, wenn man eben und deswegen haben wir die Situation, dass wir einen Staat haben, der eben nicht interveniert, wo er sollte, nämlich in Wirtschafts- und sozialen Fragen, wo man sich das wünschen würde, und interveniert in anderen Fragen, wo man sich eben wenig Staat wünschen würde. Und das Ganze ist eigentlich nur zu ändern, indem man den demokratisch kontrolliert. Und die Hoffnung ist eben, mit dieser Argumentation auch Leute zu überzeugen, dass es eben um die Kontrolle des Staates geht und nicht um den Staat per se.
Ja, danke, Ulrike. Before I hand over to Heinrich, I just want to say that, Thomas, your book is composed of two parts. In the second part, so your book is not only a critique of the left or critique of neoliberalism, how we got into this situation, but the second part is also called a progressive strategy for the 21st century. And you write a lot about economic proposals. You write about the modern monetary theory or the job guarantee and why a job guarantee is better than basic income. We haven't talked about that, so maybe this comes up in the discussion with the audience. Heinrich, bitte.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Ja, also die meisten von Ihnen kennen das Verfahren schon. Sie können jetzt Fragen stellen, indem Sie auf Slido oder Slido geschrieben, slido.com gehen, Hashtag 3863681, also Hashtag 3863681. Da können Sie Fragen reinschreiben. Das können Sie auf Englisch oder auf Deutsch machen. Und diese Fragen werden dann gleich angezeigt, die werden auch bewertet. Also die anderen Zuhörer können dann sagen, ich finde diese Frage wichtig, und die Ulrike wird die Fragen dann für Thomas ins Englische übersetzen. Und vielleicht noch den Hinweis, den Stefan Kraft gegeben hat, das finde ich wirklich wichtig. Wer sich dafür interessiert, wie sich ein Staat finanziert, was Modern Monetary Theory ist, dem ist auch unter diesem Gesichtspunkt dieses Buch empfohlen, weil es ist wirklich sehr knapp erläutert. Es hat einen analytischen Teil, es geht auf die Geschichte zurück, zeigt, wie der Staat sich selbst demontiert hat im Verhältnis zu den Kapitalmärkten. Und später wird dann gezeigt, dass das alles gar nicht notwendig war, dass der Staat die Möglichkeit hat, seine monetäre Souveränität sich zurückzuholen, oder beziehungsweise er hat es ja eigentlich immer, nur die Politiker wissen es nicht.
Wir brauchen eigentlich noch eine Veranstaltung zum zweiten Teil. Ist eigentlich schade, dass wir da gar nichts zu machen konnten.
Aber vielleicht will der eine oder andere ja jetzt bestellen und dann über die Weihnachtstage dann nachlesen. Mal gucken, was kommt. Okay, gibt es schon Fragen oder? Slido. Okay. Der Stefan Kraft ist jetzt ganz weg. Okay. Ne, jetzt ist er wieder da. Sehr schön. Also, dann
haben wir ja noch keine Bewertung. Wir können ja einfach anfangen. Dann nutzen wir die Zeit.
Raus, was du willst. Ja, komm, mach wie du willst.
Ich finde eigentlich, das ist die EU nach Ansicht von Thomas Fazi reformierbar, und was sind die wichtigsten Schritte dahin? The question is, can we change the EU? Can we reform the EU? And if yes, what are the steps to reforming it?
Well, my answer is no. So I don't think the EU is reformable in any way for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, for the EU to be sort of reformed in a deep structural sense, one would have to reform the treaties, which are the kind of de facto constitution of the EU, even though it was a constitution no one ever voted for, but you know that the EU has an economic constitution, and in fact even a sort of juridical constitution, which is written in the treaties, and those treaties can only be reformed through a unanimous vote. So by all the governments of the European Union. That's essentially what, 30 governments these days. So 30 different governments would have to agree on exactly the kind of reforms that are needed. And of course, from our perspective, those would have to be progressive reforms. So essentially what we're saying is that in every country of the European Union, for this to happen, governments which share our ideas, our left, progressive ideas of how the EU should be reformed, and I think anyone can see that that's a very unrealistic prospect, because countries have, and this is another, this is one of the problems of the European Union, is that we're not all on this, on the same boat, in a sense that we have different in different countries, we have different political cycles, different political sensibilities, we have different economic models, different economic results. So it's very unlikely, if not, and today we have very different views about geopolitics between the various regions of Europe. And so if you put all these differences together, imagining a scenario where all 30 governments of the EU agree on a sort of agenda of reform is quite unlikely, and it's even more likely that that agenda is going to be the kind of progressive agenda that we would like to see. And I think that's why, and more in general, I think the European Union was created in such a way as to not be democratically reformed. It was never intended to be democratically reformed, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why it's that they've made it so hard to do. And I think more, and if we take a step back, it's precisely because of the existence of the European Union getting into power those governments that have a progressive, radical agenda of reform for the European Union is incredibly difficult, because as soon as there's even the slight even the slight prospect of, let's say, a radical left government coming to power in one of the major countries of the European Union, then the fear machine starts to go into full motion, and so we would start seeing articles in the press about how dangerous this government would be for the financial stability of that country, for the financial stability of the European Union. We would see a full-blown propaganda campaign in the media depicting that government as irresponsible, or that party as irresponsible, a party that cannot govern. And in fact, we would also see, and we've seen this in the past, we would likely see the ECB contributing to this hysteria and to the panic by not intervening to quell whatever turbulence might happen on financial markets in the run-up to an election, but instead exacerbating those tensions. We saw this happen in Italy when it was becoming clear that the five-star movement and the League were likely to win the elections. Interest rates started to rise very rapidly, and the ECB could have intervened, but they didn't. That was a political choice. They've done even worse choices in the past, including engineering a de facto financial crisis in 2011 in Italy to get rid of Berlusconi. But even if we look at the recent French elections, we saw a lot of panic on financial markets surrounding the prospect of a Le Pen-led government. And again, this was financial. This financial turbulence was actively allowed by the ECB precisely to put pressure on voters, as if to say, this is what happens when if you vote for this party. And of course, a national central bank should do the exact opposite, should try to ensure that elections can happen in the most undisturbed way possible. They shouldn't allow financial markets to interfere in elections, but that's exactly what the ECB does. And even if this party should be able to come to power, a party that shares our views for reforming the EU, then we know, for precisely the reasons that I've just said, that they wouldn't last in government for more than 6 months, because
Thomas, sorry, I have to stop you here because we have many questions.
Sorry,
There are 50 minutes left, so we have. I ask you for some shorter answers. Ulrike,
sorry.
No problem. Ulrike, willst du kurz übersetzen oder?
Ich übersetze kurz und du kannst ja dann die nächste Frage auch machen.
Ja.
Wie war das jetzt? Ach so, ist die EU reformierbar? Die kurze Antwort heißt nein. Und das liegt daran hauptsächlich, dass die Verträge eben so gestaltet sind. Das ist ja, die EU-Verträge sind ja quasi die Verfassung der EU, auch wenn das jetzt nicht von der EU-Bevölkerung gewählt worden ist oder dafür abgestimmt worden ist. Und jede Verfassungsänderung erfordert Einstimmigkeit der 30 Regierungen. Und wenn das noch in unserem Sinne progressiv reformiert werden sollten, dann müssten wir ja 30 Regierungen haben, die für solche Reformen wären. Und das ist sehr, sehr unwahrscheinlich, weil ja die ganzen Regierungen, wenn man da mal genau hinguckt, doch verschiedene Vorstellungen haben, sowohl wie die nationale Politik aussehen könnte, Wirtschaftspolitik, aber auch international. Und insofern ist es praktisch ein Ding der Unmöglichkeit. Und so war auch die EU-Verfassung bewusst gestaltet, dass man das gar nicht kann. Und wenn heute jemand dann versucht, abweichende Sachen zu machen, dann wird man ja sofort propagandistisch oder überhaupt die Regierungen werden ja unter Druck gesetzt. Und auch die EZB macht ja auch aktiv Politik in der Richtung, dass wenn, wie in Italien zum Beispiel, die Zinsen steigen, die Finanzmärkte nervös werden, dann könnte die EZB eingreifen. Das hat sie aber bewusst nicht politisch auch nicht gemacht. Und
Okay,
insofern.
danke. Just a short information, because there was a question if this discussion is being recorded and can be seen online. And I say it in German. Es gibt einen YouTube-Kanal, Freiburger Diskurse, leicht zu finden. Dort wird dieses Video veröffentlicht und wir uns bemühen, zu dem Buch auf unserer Webseite diesen Link zu unserer Diskussion heute Abend auch dann bereitzustellen, dass man den finden kann. Ulrike, bitte Ulrike, please, the next question, which is on top here.
Well, it has been on top for a long time. So the question is whether the left, or whether it was a deliberate neoliberal policy to make the left follow, embrace identity policies and a kind of wrong international, it's
Yeah,
yes.
I get it. Yeah. Fake internationalism and globalism. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, we in the book we mostly analyze what we consider to be failings on the left, beginning theoretical and analytical failings on the left, which then translated into political failings beginning in the 70s and 80s, which were mostly sort of the making of the left. So we mainly focus on the left's embrace of globalism and supranationalism, and we mainly see that as the result of the fact that effectively the left had developed a mistaken analysis of what the kind of post-war Keynesian regime was. Most analyses on the left, including on the radical left, kind of took that regime for granted, and they thought that we had entered a new historical regime, which would have inevitably tended towards greater degrees of socialism. And so they really, they felt there wasn't much of a need to think critically about the conditions that had made that regime possible, and about the fact that those conditions might one day disappear, and what to do if that were to happen, what to do if in fact capital had wrestled control back from the masses that had effectively gained unprecedented levels of political strength in the post-war period. And this is, of course, exactly what happened, with the sort of neoliberal counter-revolution beginning in the 70s. And the left found itself completely, devoid of the analytical and theoretical tools that would have been necessary to navigate that crisis and to have an alternative to propose in place of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism was presented as the only possible solution to the crisis of the Keynesian regime. And the left really had no alternative to propose. And that's why they ended up embracing, one of the reasons at least, why they ended up embracing neoliberalism. And once they realized they had no true systemic alternative to propose to neoliberalism, then embracing supranationalism became a way to not having to confront real politics. So by shifting the terrain of politics from the democratic realm to this mythical supranational realm of the European Union, they were able to essentially avoid having to confront the fact that they really had no alternative to propose. And we saw this happening with the Labour left in the UK in the 70s, with Mitterrand in France in the 80s, and so on, and so forth. And so I think we mainly focus on the on the internal failings of the left, but of course I think there's a lot to say about the fact that we know that the US security state in the 70s poured a lot of money and resources into changing the nature of the left and shifting the left away from class issues towards identity politics, but it's not something, it's something that I personally believe happened, and I've spoken about this elsewhere, but it's not really something we focus about in the book. Yeah.
Okay, Ulrike, vielleicht kurz.
Also im Buch wird also diese Frage, ob die Linken bewusst in diese Sackgasse getrieben worden sind, nicht behandelt. Da spricht aber einiges dafür, weil eben auch sehr viel Geld und Propagandamittel darin dafür ausgegeben worden sind, die Linke in diese Richtung zu treiben. Was im Buch ist eben, dass dort wird es hauptsächlich als Folge einer falschen Analyse der Linken gesehen, dass eben ein Großteil der Linken glaubte, dass diese keynesianischen Wohlfahrtsstaaten, dass damit eine neue Phase erreicht worden ist und dass man sich schon auf dem Weg in den Sozialismus befindet. Und man hat eben nicht analysiert, was passiert, wenn das Kapital wieder mehr Macht bekommt. Und das Kapital ist aber stärker geworden und dann gab es keine linke Antwort darauf. Und Neoliberalismus stand als einzige Antwort da. Und dann war eben die Folge, dass die Linken eben praktisch ohne irgendwelche Werkzeuge dastanden, um dem Neoliberalismus was entgegensetzen zu können.
Wenn ich mir eine Frage aussuchen dürfte jetzt, dann vielleicht die da auf der, jetzt steht es nicht mehr auf der zweiten Stelle, wenn nicht die EU, also wenn man nicht davon ausgeht, dass man weiterhin in der EU organisiert werden will als Staat, wie vertritt sich Europa politisch in einer multipolaren Welt, also wo es sozusagen große Reiche gibt wie die USA oder China? Ulrike?
Okay, if we give up the EU, how can European states represent themselves in a multipolar world? How can they develop even some kind of strength?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. So if we look at the states that are driving the shift towards multipolarity, if we look at BRICS, but also the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN, and other similar organizations that bring together countries of the what's the politically correct term these days? It's not, countries of the global South plus China together. None of those countries are adopting the EU's kind of supranational model. So the world of multipolarity that is emerging, that has already emerged, is a world that is organized along very different lines than from the European Union. It's a world that's organized around countries retaining their national sovereignty, retaining their national autonomy, which means for those countries that have liberal democratic regimes, it means maintaining a right for citizens to democratically decide the fate of their nations on a number of crucial issues. It means allowing for the cultural distinctiveness of countries while at the same time collaborating together on common issues. If we look at BRICS, if we look at the ASEAN, they're all very loose associations where countries can make different policies on the same issue, while at the same time coming together to collaborate on other issues that concern all states. And I think we're seeing this model working very well. If we look at other continents as well, if we look at Latin America, if we look at Africa, no group of states is considering moving towards the kind of EU-like supranational model because they can see that it has failed. They can see that the multipolar world is choosing a completely different model, which is one that mixes national sovereignty with what the old left would have simply called internationalism. You know, internationalism is very different from supranationalism. Supranationalism negates national self-determination, it negates national democracy. Internationalism is premised on the collaboration between sovereign relatively autonomous countries. So it's a completely different model. That's the model that the world is choosing. And I think if the EU wants to be part of that world, it has to let go of this kind of late imperial thinking that, oh, we have to be big and strong in order to interact with that world, because those other countries, most of which are much economically weaker than Europe, are not thinking that way. China is not thinking of creating some kind of Asian supranational empire controlled from Beijing, right? And much weaker countries are not thinking of banding together and creating a monetary union or currency union in order to become stronger. And so I think this is the model we should follow as well. And I think, you know, size does not size and sovereignty do not go hand in hand. You can be very big and economically powerful, as the EU is, and be incredibly geopolitically weak, as the EU is. So the EU, I think, is also the perfect example that at the end of the day, pooling sovereignty doesn't make you stronger in political and geopolitical terms. It makes you weaker. It makes individual countries less flexible to react to the changing international situation. And so I think if to truly embrace multipolarity, I think we should fully embrace also the fundamental, the model of international organization that these countries are adopting, which is one of internationalism, not supranationalism.
Okay.
Also, man muss das Konzept der EU eigentlich aufgeben, dass man glaubt, dass Größe und Souveränität in die gleiche Richtung, also dass das zusammengehört, dass man, je größer man ist, desto souveräner ist man.
That's already in English. Are you reading the second question? Oh.
No, I'm translating.
Oh, sorry. Excuse
me. No problem. She's translating your answer.
No problem. Yes, okay. So, und die EU ist ja das beste Beispiel dafür, wie wenig souverän die EU ist, obwohl sie doch relativ stark ist. Also die Staaten des globalen Südens haben sich für ein anderes Modell entschieden, wo sie nationale Autonomie in den Mittelpunkt stellen und ihre verschiedenen kulturellen Identitäten und politische Systeme, und dass sie international da zusammenarbeiten mit den Staaten, wo es passt. Und wenn es dann Dissens gibt, dann arbeiten sie halt mit den Staaten nicht zusammen. Und dann gibt es noch Sachen, wo alle zusammen an einem Thema, einen Strang ziehen. Und das ist aus Sicht von Thomas Fazi eben wahrer Internationalismus im Gegensatz zum undemokratischen Supranationalismus.
Okay, I will read the next question because it's in English.
Sure.
Obviously, there are now being two camps, the globalists and the advocates of sovereignty, whether they have their roots in left or right parties. What do you say about that, Thomas?
So is it obsolete to speak of left and right? It depends how we define left and right. In the contemporary political debate, I agree. The terms have become completely meaningless. They don't mean what they traditionally, those words used to have meaning. They used to, represent specific worldviews, ideologies. They mainly represented different views of how to economically organize society, right? So right usually meant sort of more pro-market and less state, and left usually meant more state and less market, in very, very simple terms. That is clearly not what those terms mean anymore. They've been completely emptied of any connection to what they traditionally meant. And so today I would say, yes, the terms left and right are largely used as tools to divide the population by appealing to tribalism and tribal identities. But I do think that we still need to, we still need words to describe reality. And so I think we need to be able to describe an economic platform that that advocates for giving complete freedom to private capital and to economic elites and oligarchies, which is, I think, largely what goes under the banner of libertarianism today. We need to be able to distinguish that from a political platform that advocates for the state controlling those private powers in order to empower citizens and workers, which is what I would consider, a left economic program. So again, this is part of the problem that problems that we face these days, is that a lot of the words that we, a lot of the traditional political vocabulary that we have used has lost a lot of its meaning. So maybe we need some new political vocabulary to understand what we're talking about, because I know that this is not what most people understand when they hear left and right. But on the question, yes, are the two main camps today globalism and sovereigntism? Yes and no. I mean, yes, though, globalism versus sovereignty is clearly, and I think I made that pretty clear, is obviously a crucial issue, and that's something that I do believe in. I would always choose sovereignty over globalism, because, as I said, I think sovereignty means democratic self-determination, democratic popular sovereignty. But of course, I would still like to see people advocating sovereignty for the right reasons. So, this is the progressive vision of sovereignty that we talk about in the book. I mean, yes, reclaiming sovereignty is important, but then we need to know what to do with the sovereignty, with that sovereignty that we have reclaimed. And I find it problematic that most right-wing sovereigntist parties today almost exclusively frame the need to reclaim sovereignty in purely identitarian and cultural terms. And I'm not saying that those issues are completely devoid of any meaning. For example, the need to better regulate immigration or whatever, but it can't be reduced to that. And so I find it concerning when right-wing sovereigntist parties have nothing really to say about, have no real alternative, economic alternative to propose to neoliberalism. That is why I would prefer to see a left vision of sovereignty being developed, which sees the reclaiming of sovereignty as the first step towards building a sort of a society that that operates according to very different rules than our contemporary neoliberal societies. So in that sense, I think that left and right are still meaningful, but yeah.
Okay, Ulrike, bitte.
Achso, nee, ich muss jetzt gucken, wo wir sind. Okay, also im Prinzip ist es so, dass Thomas Fazi in jedem Fall Souveränität als Basis demokratischer Selbstbestimmung sieht und deswegen das vorzieht gegen Globalismus. Aber es geht halt darum, Souveränität aus den richtigen Gründen zu fördern. Und es ist eben nicht egal, warum man souverän sein möchte als Staat. Und man muss eben gleichzeitig klären, was man eigentlich damit machen will, mit dieser Souveränität. Und da ist es halt so, dass die Rechte in vielen Fällen die Sachen auf eben kulturelle, identitäre Fragen, Einwanderung und so weiter reduziert und keine ökonomische Alternative aufzeigt. Und das ist eben genau das, was eine progressive Vision von Souveränität machen muss.
Mhm. Thomas, I would like to combine two questions about the Brexit. So after the Brexit, Great Britain has obviously gained more national sovereignty than before. Is this a better situation for the left in Great Britain, or is there a left that can capitalize out of this situation? On the other hand, we have now seen the biggest marches by the extreme right in Great Britain for a long time. So is this not contrary to your analysis, what happened after the Brexit?
Right. No, I don't think it is. So I think it's important to realize that first and foremost, we have to distinguish between the policies that are implemented by whatever government is in power and the more structural conditions within which a state operates. So I supported Brexit, even though clearly it was being proposed by parties and movements on the right, not because I thought that the day after Brexit, those parties would have implemented particularly good policies as a result of Brexit. I did it because I believe in democracy, and I think that being outside of the European Union does make the UK a more sovereign country and therefore a more democratic country. If Corbyn were to come to power, Corbyn or any other sort of say radical left or socialist figure or party should come to power, today they would be in a much better position to implement. And in fact, I mentioned at the time how a lot of Corbyn's policies back at the time of the Brexit referendum, a lot of the policies that he was proposing would not have been legally feasible under EU law, such as fully renationalizing the railway service and a host of other proposals that he was making would not have been possible under EU law. So I think it's important to think in structural terms. So having more sovereignty, I would say, is always better than having less, because it means having more democracy. Does that automatically mean that you will get better policies? No, of course it doesn't, because then that is a result of political and democratic struggles within the country. Now, in terms of the right gaining more and more power, well, that's in a way that's largely the anti-immigration protests that we're seeing now are largely a reaction to the complete disregard for what voters were asking for with Brexit. So we know that the Brexit vote was to a large degree also driven by concerns about what were perceived as excessive immigration levels, and instead what have we seen since the victory of the Leave vote? A surge in immigration in the UK. I mean, that's just like smacking people in the face. And so of course, so if you completely disregard people's concerns over and over again, then their reaction is going to become increasingly extreme and increasingly violent. I think this has always been the case. Now the question, I think we can probably connect. Oh, sorry, no. If you want to translate this, and then I'll move on to the next question. Yes.
Ulrike?
Das ist insofern, also Fazi war für den Brexit, weil es Großbritannien demokratischer macht, grundsätzlich, weil man damit einfach die Möglichkeit hat, dass man eben die EU-Gesetze sich daran nicht halten kann, sondern selber bestimmen kann, in welche Richtung das gehen kann. Und wenn jetzt eine linke Regierung heute an die Macht käme, dann könnte sie viele Dinge heute umsetzen, die Corbyn zum Beispiel nicht hätte umsetzen können ohne Brexit, weil die EU-Gesetze das einfach verboten hätten. Aber gibt es automatisch deswegen eine bessere Politik? Natürlich nicht, weil die Politik ist immer das Ergebnis der politischen Auseinandersetzungen in einem Land. Warum die Rechte heute stärker wird, ist klar daraus zu erklären, dass genau das, was die Bevölkerung mit Brexit sich gewünscht hat, viele Leute, nämlich weniger Immigration, nicht passiert ist, sondern im Gegenteil, dass die Immigration noch stärker ist. Und deswegen ist es eine ganz klare, normale Reaktion der Bevölkerung, dass sie dann eben protestieren, wenn ihre Wünsche nicht erfüllt werden.
Thomas, you have picked out a question you wanted to answer?
No, I was just saying that what I was saying kind of naturally segues into the next question, which is, will the globalists give over power? And so, yes, I think when we talk of reclaiming sovereignty and reclaiming democracy, we also have to face the fact that liberal democracy, as we have known it, is facing a deep crisis, to say the least. And I think this has to do with a number of reasons. I mean, partly it has to do with the fact that the material structures that sustained mass democracy and that I think made democracy relatively substantive, relatively real, so to speak, in the post-war, for some decades in the post-war period, was the fact that the power of capital, the organized power of capital, was counterbalanced by the organized power of citizens, of workers that were organized through mass unions, through mass parties. Now we don't have, that doesn't exist anymore. That kind of, the conditions that sustained mass democracy, and which I think are the reason why the masses were able to relatively constrain the power of capital for a few decades. Those conditions are no longer there as a result of deep transformations in the mode of production, disappearance of large factories, the individualization of society. We live in very different societies, and so I find it's hard to imagine those conditions returning. And so we have to start thinking about what does democracy even mean in an age of social atomization and pulverization, right? Including the atomization of workers, which are also increasingly individualized. So that's one issue, and which makes it very hard to challenge the structures of power, to challenge the globalists, because these days most politics is largely reduced to elections, but that's not enough. I mean, back when we had mass parties, you won an election, but you had an entire party structure and support system in society that sustained you. Today, a party can get millions of votes and even be the first party in the country, but that doesn't mean that it is sustained by networks of militants, of members. It simply means that people went out and voted for them. But those are sort of coalitions that can crumble very, very easily. And so that's part of the problem. And then another part of the problem is that, yes, the elites are desperate about losing power. They don't want to give up power. I think we are really witnessing in some ways the final days of a regime, especially in Europe, and as in the final moments of every regime, that regime tends to become more authoritarian, more repressive, which is why today we see the kind of EU and pro-EU elites resorting to increasing levels of censorship, of propaganda, of repression. And I think part of it is that they're terrified of losing power. But at the same time, on the one hand, they know that they have less and less legitimacy, less and less consensus. They are, they can feel these, and these parties. They can see these new parties rising, these anti-establishment parties rising, and this makes them more and more desperate. It makes them double down on the censorship, double down on the propaganda. But of course, no regime can rule forever without legitimacy and without consensus. So I think this gives us some reason for hope. These elites cannot remain in power forever, because yes, they've got all the economic power. They've got they control. They have the police, they have the military on their side, but that's not enough to ultimately to govern. To govern, you need consensus and legitimacy, and they have none. So I think in the short term, we'll see things will get worse, but hopefully we'll see the collapse of this regime not too far in the future.
Thank you. Heinrich, haben wir noch Zeit für Übersetzung von Ulrike?
Wir können ruhig noch was machen, aber ich denke, langsam sollten wir zum Ende kommen.
Ja, Ulrike, bitte.
Vielleicht ist das auch ein ganz guter Abschluss jetzt, die Antwort auf diese Frage. Davon ab.
Ja.
Also es geht ja darum, was war jetzt nochmal die Frage? Ach so, ob es einen Bürgerkrieg geben wird. Also die liberale Demokratie ist in einer tiefen Krise heute. Und das liegt vor allem daran, dass die materiellen Grundlagen, die die Demokratie jetzt in den Zeiten der Wohlfahrtsstaaten am Leben gehalten haben, heute nicht mehr sind, weil es ganz große Veränderungen gegeben hat, wie die Fabriken organisiert, wie die Arbeit organisiert wird und so weiter. Und deswegen sind eben die Voraussetzungen, und also in diesen Wohlfahrtsstaaten, ging es halt darum, dass eine Balance zwischen Kapital und Arbeit da war. Und diese Balance ist heute nicht mehr gegeben und die kann man auch nicht wiederbekommen. Deswegen müssen wir halt heute überlegen, in einem Zeitalter, wo eben die Leute viel mehr individualisiert sind, wie kann denn da Demokratie hergestellt werden? Beispiel ist eben, dass heute, wenn Parteien gewählt werden, dass das sehr brüchige Ergebnisse sind, weil im Gegensatz zu Zeiten der keynesianischen Wohlfahrtsstaaten die ganze organisierten Strukturen fehlen. Also früher eine Arbeiterpartei, die SPD oder auch überhaupt die Arbeiterschaft war halt organisiert. Die waren zusammen in Fabriken, die wohnten zusammen, die hatten ihre Sportvereine und alles Mögliche. Das alles ist heute kaputt. Und deswegen ist es sehr schwierig, Koalitionen zu schließen. Das ist also die Seite der Protestierenden vielleicht oder der kritischen, des Anti-Establishments. Auf der anderen Seite ist es so, die Eliten wollen ihre Macht nicht aufgeben. Und es könnte sein, dass wir jetzt am Endpunkt eines Regimes sind. Und wenn das Regime am Zerfallen ist, dann ist es klar, dass da große Angst vor Machtverlust ist. Und irgendwie dass man immer autoritärer reagiert darauf, dass einem die Legitimität verloren geht und auch der Konsens innerhalb der Gesellschaft. Und das kann eben auf die Dauer nicht funktionieren. Und daraus schließt Thomas Fazi, dass es wahrscheinlich erstmal sehr viel schlechter wird und auch repressiver wird, dass aber in absehbarer Zeit eben sich das ändern muss, weil so ein System sich nicht auf Dauer halten kann.
Okay, mache ich Schluss? Okay, thank you very much, Thomas, for your explanations and for your translation, Ulrike, and your questions. Stefan, to you three, Markus will send you all a new link that we can have a short reflection of our webinar. Sorry?
Debriefing would be the English word.
Yes. Just sure. 5 minutes, because I think it was exhausting for you, all of you. But thank you very much, and hopefully now some people are interested to read the book of you, Thomas, maybe
I think it's
in
worth
English
it.
or better in Germany. In German, okay. Okay, thank you
Hopefully.
very much. You can leave me and I make the end of.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Okay. Ich mache jetzt auf Deutsch weiter. Also, machen Sie Werbung für uns. Die Erfahrung ist, dass wir am besten bekannt werden, indem Bekannte erst Bekannten erzählen. Wenn Sie noch nicht auf unserem Verteiler sind, tun Sie das. Und vor allen Dingen abonnieren Sie unseren YouTube-Kanal. Und wenn Sie eine interessante Veranstaltung bei uns entdecken, leiten Sie es einfach weiter an Bekannte, die einfach Interesse daran haben. Ja. Nochmal die Bitte, uns etwas zu spenden. Spendenkonto Volksbank Freiburg finden Sie auf unserer Website oder eben über PayPal. Ja. Wir bereiten fürs nächste Jahr Veranstaltungen vor. Wir verraten es aber noch nicht. Wir kennen es nämlich selber noch nicht, was wir genau machen, aber wir haben einige Ideen. Erstmal schöne Feiertage, schöne Weihnachten und einen guten Rutsch ins neue Jahr. Und vielleicht wollen Sie ja die eine oder andere Veranstaltung von uns auf YouTube sich angucken. Machen Sie es gut. Bis dann. Ciao.